Hi, viewers. Welcome to Conversations Through Isaiah, and we are in part 3. I'm here again with Dr. Andrew Davies from the University of Birmingham. Thank you, Andrew.
Hello, Russ. Thank you for having me. Good to be back.
Yeah, it's been fascinating so far. Thanks for doing the introduction. And last week we looked at guilt according to Isaiah. It was a bit heavy going, the guilt one, but important. It's important in order to get to where we need to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. At least we ended on a positive note, I suppose. But yeah, it's a bit of a guilt trip at the start, isn't it?
Well, we're going to try and wrestle now. And I must admit, viewers, I laid this on Andrew as a title of a session. And even now, as I'm looking at the title, I'm thinking, how on earth did I expect anyone to wrestle with this? But God, according to Isaiah. So the best we can do is probably skim the service. So thank you, Andrew, even for trying to help me through this. But I'm sure, as previously, I'll glean some things from it. So here we go. God, according to Isaiah. So before we delve into any particular chapter, any particular passage, what does Isaiah think of God?
One of the things that's most distinctive is that little phrase, the Holy One of Israel. That's Isaiah's favourite word for God. He uses that term very frequently. And that emphasises, well, obviously the holiness of God, that the holiness is God's distinctive characteristic, if you like. Holiness is the thing that shapes and defines and molds his character and demonstrates his character most obviously. So that holiness has consequences for Israel. It has consequences for God in the sense that it shapes God's interaction with the world. But it's not just the holiness that's the important part of that phrase, it's the of Israel part as well. So God is absolutely holy, but God is absolutely the God of Israel in a very distinctive sense. He's also the God of the nations. He also claims authority over Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, all the other foreign nations. One of the messages of Isaiah is that all those nations ultimately will come to Jerusalem and worship. But God has a very specific, a very close, a very personal relationship with Israel and Judah in the first case. He is the Holy One, but the Holy One of Israel. That's the starting point, I think.
Okay, just an aside on that, just to remind viewers that we are, Isaiah's context is the southern kingdom, Judah, and yet this term, the Holy One of Israel, is clearly important to Isaiah. And I guess Isaiah was there harking to the united promised land, as well as descendants of Jacob. Is that right?
He is, yeah. So if he wants to refer to the northern kingdom, which is destroyed kind of pretty much at the start of his reign, but if he does, his prophetic ministry, if he does want to talk of the northern as specific, then he used the word Ephraim, basically. So the 10 tribes of the north, he calls those Ephraim. If he's talking about the 12 tribes together, he'll call those Israel. And if he's talking about just Judah, he'll also call that Israel, meaning kind of greater Israel, meaning Judah as the continuation of Davidic, Solomonic Israel.
Okay, right, get that. Worth clearing that up. And if Ephraim was one of the children of Joseph.
Absolutely. Ephraim, the two that are most often associated with the northern kingdoms. But yeah, Isaiah doesn't tend to use Manasseh very much, not least because there's a king Manasseh right at the end of Isaiah's life, and so he avoids that confusion there, I guess. But yeah, Ephraim is the word that he uses if he wants to mean the north and only the north.
Okay, so God as the Holy One of Israel, that's Isaiah's phrase, loves it, repeats it regularly. How else does Isaiah view God?
So God is the creator. That's the second very prominent expression of Isaiah's theology, really. Everything that happens because God chose to initiate it. Nothing happens without his passage in chapter 50. He speaks and things happen. He speaks and things come into being. It's not only present in chapter 55, but throughout the whole story, this narrative around the universe exists because I created it. Nobody else has created any part of it. And not with a kind of sense of self-aggrandizement, not God saying, oh, look at how brilliant I am, but God kind of objectively laying claim to authority over all of the universe, right? I deserve to be given attention by the universe because I'm the one that created it. If I wasn't here, it would never have existed. All sin for Isaiah boils down to a failure to acknowledge God's lordship. And again, that's not God saying, oh, I need the praise, I can't cope without being acknowledged, right? He's insecure in any way. It's just a logical outcome of the fact that the world belongs to him because he's the one who created it. Its existence depends upon him. So that idea of God as the creator really shapes so many different aspects of Isaiah's other theology as well.
Was that unusual, Andrew, for peoples of that day, other nations, to think of their gods? Because as I understand it, there were local gods, tribal gods. Did they think of their gods as the universal creator, or was that something special for Isaiah?
It's not absolutely unique to him, it's just distinctive in the way that it's used. But many of the other nations had an idea of their gods as having had some creative power. And actually some religions at the time afforded the kind of privilege of creation to the chief god of their pantheon or something like that, or maybe all the gods together. The Babylonian creation story describes how all the gods got together in heaven and decided they wanted somebody to do the gardening for them, basically, and so created people to put on the earth so that they didn't have to work. The motive behind creation is quite interesting in some of these other stories, but Isaiah's God creates the universe for humanity to inhabit so that his plan and purpose can be fulfilled. It's not a kind of plan B, if you like. It's not the Babylonian gods thinking, oh dear, we've made a mess here. We've got a world and we've got nobody to look after it. What do we do? It was always God's intention. God has a plan for Isaiah, and creation is the start of that plan, and redemption is the culmination of that plan when he brings all the nations of the world back into relationship with himself.
Okay, yeah, and that's important, I guess, for us to understand too, to believe that God has a plan. He had a plan. We are a part of it. And there is an invitation, isn't there? In fact, harking back to last week, that little phrase, come, let's reason together, let's hammer this out. Part of that, I guess, is humanity. Join in with me in fulfilling this plan. You are a vital part of it, rather than us just being some minions who, God has invented as a plan B to sort out something. It's important that we see ourselves as part of the process for making Earth, our part of the cosmos, what it should be. Okay, Andrew, thank you. Last week we looked at guilt, and we talked a bit about judgment, and Isaiah has a view of God as judge, clearly. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the courtroom is one of the common locations that you find in the book of Isaiah. We talked last week about chapter 1, where Isaiah sees God as the appellant, if you like, making a complaint in the court of the universe that heaven and earth have to hear. Quite frequently, though, God is the judge, and God is sat there saying, okay, well, if you've got evidence for these kind of accusations that you're leveling against me, if you've got reason for rebelling against me, if there are other gods who you think could do a better job than I could, bring them forward. Let me hear their case. And of course, we're met with silence. So that judge and king metaphor go hand in hand together, really. God is saying, look, I have absolute authority. If you can find somebody else who deserves that authority, fine by me. Let's talk to them. Let's hear what they've got to say. And the other two themes really that go alongside judge and king are redeemer and rescuer, really. So there's this little square where God says, I am judging you and evaluating your performance and your conduct against the standards that I expect from you as your king. These are the rules I set out that you're not following, so I'm judging you for that. But because I love you, because I'm still your king and you're still my people, once I've judged you, I'm quite happy to redeem you and bring you through, and even to rescue you and take you on and take you forward and take you into a brighter new future. So you do get this theme in Isaiah of what's sometimes called the second Exodus, that just as God brought the children of Israel out of slavery in Egypt, brought them out of bondage, brought them into the promised land, so too he's able to bring them out of exile, return them to the promised land, but return them to the promised land metaphorically as well as literally. In other words, restore them to not only the joy of their salvation, but to their status as his tool for mission to the world, restore them as his messenger. So that little kind of quadrilateral all belongs together, really. God the judge who punishes, who holds to account, God the king who establishes the rules, God the redeemer who brings the world back into relationship with him, and God the rescuer who's prepared to step in to intervene to save his people.
Right. And again, whether you can help us with this, how should that, other than as a study of Isaiah and what Isaiah thought, how should that affect us today in our view of God, or even as preachers, say, or messengers of God, whether it be people in the church who are sharing to others what God is like? Should it inform our message in any way? Because we don't like to talk about God as judge much. So should it be a background information for us, or should it be part of our message that as well as being a redeemer and a rescuer, someone who wants to make everything right, there is this judgment part of God? What do you think?
So I think we need to realize that judge doesn't mean an old man with a funny wig and a red robe and a hammer sat behind a big desk, okay? For judge, think of somebody like Deborah in the book of Judges. Think of the judges who are making determinations as the course of people's lives and destinies. Think of judges in the context of shaping attitudes and kind of creating opportunities for injustices to be created, to be corrected as well. So yes, absolutely, there's certainly an element of punishment for sin, and we don't do very well with that in today's world. We don't like to think of ourselves as sinful. We quite like thinking of lots of other people as sinful, people who vote for other political parties, people who go to other churches. We don't like very much thinking of ourselves as fundamentally sinful. And it's a really important reminder to be brought back to. But the judge aspect of God's role in Isaiah isn't just about sin and its consequences, important though those are. I think what we can learn from a varied presentation of the character and the conduct of God, such as we get in Isaiah, is that God is not some great machine in the sky. It's all too easy sometimes to get this idea that we have to kind of punch in the right code and we get the right response, that if we say the right words, it's an automatic process and God will bless us. It's not like that. God doesn't work like that. God isn't a kind of robot or a machine. He is a character. He is a person with personality. He has his own mind, he makes his own decisions, he makes his own choices. And in the book of Isaiah, he's really presented as a rounded character. You see lots of different aspects of him. And I love that we don't just see a kind of 2D God in Isaiah. We see him in glorious technicolor and in full 3D. Isaiah says, if you like, well, look at this aspect of God. And then let's turn around from this angle and see this aspect of God as well. And understanding the kingship of God helps us understand the judgeship of God more effectively and more fully and more comprehensively, helping us understand that God redeems us, makes the enormity of the punishment that he puts upon the people of Israel all the more severe, and makes his saving intervention all the more miraculous, really. So he's saving them from judgment that he's sent. He had to satisfy his own justice. He had to punish them, as we saw last week, but also he had to redeem them. That's another aspect of it as well, because the covenant commitment is always there. So I think seeing those different aspects of God and letting them interact is actually really important for us.
Yeah. So the bringing out of these attributes of God to Isaiah, in some ways, because Isaiah fully understands how much the people of Judah matter to God. They really matter to God. And because they matter to God, because his love is towards them that much, these attributes of God have to be on display. They were the people of Judah. They were Israel because God wanted them to represent him. That's how special they are. And in turn, that's how special we are too. The Absolutely. Image bearers, and even taking that, the term which was very late term as in history, Christian, little Christs, Christ-like people. We bear that term, and therefore we matter so much to God. And therefore, not just his redemption has to be on display, but his justice and his kingship has to be on display too. Now, you've hinted at this, but in what ways was Isaiah's God unique? Unlike any other God from the Babylonians and the Assyrians.
I think if you said to Isaiah, you can have just one word to describe God, you're only allowed one, you can't even have Holy One, forget that, one word. I think the word that he would go for would be unique. There is nobody like God. The middle bit of the book of Isaiah, what's sometimes called by academics Deutero-Isaiah, chapters 40 to 55, is the most beautiful part of the whole Hebrew Bible, I think. The most poetic, the most inspirational. If you get discouraged, if you get depressed, go pick up Isaiah 40 to 55, read it through in one sitting, and if you don't come away transformed and uplifted and inspired by what you've read, then your heart is made of stone, I'm sure. It's the most uplifting and inspirational picture. Because it's just so vivid and so poetic. Isaiah uses lots of rhetorical questions to talk about God. Who else is there that's kind of redeemed the world? Who else is there that's stepped in to save you? Who else understands how nature works? Those kind of rhetorical questions he keeps throwing out in God's voice. Who else has done the things that I've been able to do, God says. And again, it's not arrogance. It's not God saying, oh, look, I'm better than everybody else. It's the logical outcome of an understanding of who God is. Once you understand that nobody is like God, then you can't put people on the same platform as him. There's nobody competing with him at the top of the league table. There's nobody in the same league table. There's nobody in the same sport, okay? God is dimensions above anybody else. I mentioned Isaiah chapter 55 earlier on about God's word having creative power. Isaiah also says in that very famous passage that God's ways are higher than ours. There are a different dimension of ways, a different dimension of thought. He doesn't approach things the way we do, and there's nobody else that falls into that category. So imagine you are one of the exiles from Judah. You're in Babylon in the middle of the 6th century BC.
Yeah.
You've been taken away from your homeland. You're in captivity in Babylon. Imagine what an inspirational message it will be to remind you that all the gods of the Babylonians pale into insignificance in the presence of Yahweh. Nobody else, none of the other idols that are surrounding you have got any influence over the course of human history, but our God reigns. Our God is the one who can intervene, who can restore, who can redeem, and who is your King.
Yeah, beautiful. And I just wonder whether it's worth me reading through Isaiah 40, or at least most of Isaiah 40. Is that okay? Now,
yeah, let's do that.
Again, people will need to remember from episode 1 that we have this gap between chapter 39 and chapter 40, if I'm remembering this correctly. This is where we jump in time. So Isaiah 40 onwards is after the exile.
Just at the end of the exile, so just before the people return. So the first 11 verses of Isaiah 40 are really God saying, get ready, clear the road, make wide the way. It's about time for you to return home. So just right at the very end.
Okay, right. So here we go. Isaiah 40 verse 12. I'm just going to carry on reading it through. Andrew, you jump in if you need to, or we can do all the comments at the end. It's entirely up to you. Isaiah 40 verse 12. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in balance? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has instructed him? Whom did he consult for his enlightenment, and who taught him the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? Even the nations are like a drop from a bucket, and are counted as dust on the scales. See, he takes up the isles like fine dust. Lebanon would not provide fuel enough, nor are its animals enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness.
Maybe let's talk about those few verses for a second, really, because yeah. I think what Isaiah's trying to do in these verses is address some of the objections that Israel, Judah might bring up to him. And he's said in chapter 40, verses 1 to 11, God is stopping punishing you now. He's restoring you. He's taking you home to the promised land. And there would have been some objections that the people would have brought in response to that. One of those would be, is God powerful enough to do that? Can God really do what he's promised? So has God got the strength to do it, is the first aspect of that. And in these verses, Isaiah's saying, yes, absolutely. Who else is bigger than God? Who taught God knowledge? Who gave God understanding? Nobody. Knowledge and understanding all have their origin in God. Is God powerful enough to do what he says he's going to do? Yes, 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 absolutely. Nobody else could. Our God can.
It reminds me of the passage in later Job when God says, are you questioning me? And then God just goes on this, I don't know, is it 3 chapters long? It can't be far off 3 chapters of just listing his attributes and, you know, what he's done and how he's drawn out the heavens. It's, you know, were you there, Job? When? I love it. I love it. It's just God showing off. And this seems a little bit like that.
Yeah, that's my favorite bit of the book of Job as well, really. I love the fact that God likes people in the Hebrew Bible to talk back to him. He's not frightened by that. He likes the honesty and the frankness. You see it loads of times in the Psalms. There's this lament narrative. God, why have you deserted me? Why have you forsaken me? Why haven't you stepped in? You get it in the book of Habakkuk. God, why aren't you doing something about the world? But then God's not prepared to answer back. He'll kind of come out, he says to Habakkuk, for instance, well, I absolutely am doing something. I'm using the Babylonians. And Habakkuk goes, God, that's a dreadful choice. The Babylonians are wicked. And why on earth would you do that? And God comes back and says, look, I know what I'm doing. Just get on with it. And at the end of that book, having started off with God doesn't know what he's doing, Habakkuk ends with, okay, though the fig tree doesn't bud and there are no grapes on the vine, there's no cattle in the pen, still I will rejoice in God my Saviour. I've started off with, I'm not too sure that God knows what he's doing here, and I've ended in a position of complete faith despite the circumstances. Isaiah doesn't go on quite the same journey. He starts off here, basically. So he's starting from a position of complete faith and absolute trust in God. But Isaiah's God is time and time again confronting those objections. If you think I don't know what I'm doing, if you think that other gods would have led you better, if you think there are other options, bring them on, let's see them, kind of thing. If you think I could have done something different, then let's hear what those are. He's not afraid to have people talk back to him, and he's not afraid to stand up for his own righteousness and holiness and power and goodness.
Yeah, love that. It's great. Okay, let's carry on. I think we got to verse 18.
Yeah.
To whom then will you liken God? Or what likeness compare him with? An idol? A workman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts it for silver chains. As a gift one chooses mulberry wood, wood that will not rot, then seeks out a skilled artisan to set up an image that will not topple. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth when he blows upon them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble.
Brilliantly read, Pastor Russ. Super. And brilliant words as well, aren't they? Aren't they amazing? The question here is God unique enough? First of all, he's asking, is God powerful enough? Now he's saying, is God unique enough? Is there somebody else that we can turn to as well? Quite often in the earlier part of Isaiah, as the kings who are in control of Jerusalem at the time are facing various external challenges, they often go off to seek the help of other nations around. And Isaiah's message then in chapters 1 to 39 is very much trust God despite the circumstances. Don't try and solve the problem on your own. Don't try and get lots of other people in to come and help out. Here his message is, look, there is nobody else who could help out. There is nobody like God. Who are you going to compare him with? Isaiah has a bit of a tirade against idolatry, and I love this. I think it's quite amusing in some ways. In chapter 44, for instance, he does this at scale and spectacularly. And he says, just imagine this scenario, right? A woodsman goes into the forest, chooses a nice tree and thinks, oh, that's a beautiful tree, that'll make a superb idol, as you do, cuts the tree down, starts to carve the tree into this god. And Isaiah's got this thing, he says it 2 or 3 times, you have to make sure that the bottom of the idol is stable, right? You have to make sure it's level, because the worst thing in the world is a wobbly idol. Imagine putting it on the shelf in your house and it just keeps wobbling or falling over, kind of thing. So that's a really clever metaphor, because what he's saying is the God who created the heavens and the earth is completely stable. He's a rock. He's not a lump of wood. He's our refuge. He's our fortress. He's our strong tower. He's not going anywhere compared to this idol. Is it level? Is it going to stay stable, kind of thing? I love the way he does that. And you even have to have like little chains to hold it in place so it doesn't get knocked off course. Our God is not like that, he says. But to go back to this woodsman in the field, he's just made this idol. It's now ready to go to the goldsmith for the goldsmith to put the gold on it, etc. And whilst he's kind of getting ready to take it down for the gold to be put on, he stops to have his lunch and kind of takes the bits of wood that he's carved off the idol and throws them on the fire and lights a fire to kind of warm his baked beans on. And Isaiah says kind of mischievously, oh dear, doesn't he think, what if by accident I've actually burnt God? What if the idol isn't the God bit of this tree? What if the stuff that I've just thrown on the fire is? Wouldn't that be a tragedy, kind of thing? And just pointing out how intellectually foolish it is, as well as morally foolish, the whole idea of idolatry. Why would you make something and then bow down and worship something and say, this is what made me, when you've just 5 minutes before carved it yourself, when you are burning the rest of it to make your tea on? The futility of idolatry is something that Isaiah really has a little tirade about every now and again. So what he's trying to say is, not only are there no other gods in heaven like God, there are no other gods on earth like God either. The idols, even if you choose posh wood, even if you have a static, level back underneath for them so they don't wobble, they all pale into insignificance in the presence of God. None of them can come forward and say they've done anything. And to go back to the courtroom metaphor for a second, there are other episodes in Deutero-Isaiah where the prophet has God coming out and saying, well, if there are other gods that have helped you, if there was somebody else who led you out of captivity, if there's somebody else who prophesied what was going to happen and it came to fulfillment, let's see them, bring them forward. They've got eyes, these idols that you've been carving, haven't they? Have they seen anything? They've got mouths. Let them speak for us. And of course, they can't because they're lumps of wood. So are you going to compare the God who created the heavens and the earth with a bit of wood, even if it's a pretty bit of wood that you've carved and put some gold on? Just doesn't make sense at all, does it?
It's fantastically done, isn't it?
What goes through people's minds when they make idols is quite an interesting thing to think about, really. So Isaiah is parodying here and is making fun of them, obviously. But I think most people, when they make idols, don't think that the object that they've just made is what they're worshipping. They think it is symbolic of that God, for instance. So actually, there's a very famous example, of course, in the book of Exodus about an idol that the people of Israel make, the golden calf, whilst Moses is on Mount Sinai. And I think if you read it carefully, what is going on there is that A, they're worried that Moses isn't there, and B, they want to have some symbolic representation of the presence of the Lord, right? So they're not creating this golden calf to be an alternative God. It's originally created as a representation of God's presence. But very, very quickly, at that experience at Mount Sinai, you see that they start actually worshipping this God, this idol. Rather than seeing it as a symbol of God's presence, it becomes a God that we bow down and worship. And that becomes a problem for them there and then. Jeroboam at the division of the kingdom does a very similar thing. Let's create a shrine to Yahweh, to God, but very quickly people start worshipping that idol. So I think fundamentally what God is saying here is, don't build idols that you then come along and worship. He's saying not that you can't represent me visually, because actually I think some artistic representation of God, some cultural representation of God is really quite helpful to us in some ways. I wish fewer of the pictures of God portrayed him as an old man with a long white beard in a cloud, because he doesn't look very much like that at all, I think. But I think trying to understand God visually is quite helpful to us some ways. The problem is that we're not very good sometimes at distinguishing a representation of the character of God from worshipping that object. I think that's the trap we often fall into.
Great, thank you. So let's, verse 25 we got to. To whom then will you compare me? Or who is my equal, says the Lord? Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power. Not one is missing.
Okay, it's worth picking up on that. And again, we're carrying on with that, is God unique enough theme. And God is saying, well, yes, I'm different from any idol you can make. He's now saying I'm different from the stars and the sun and the moon, kind of thing. Why would he bother making that point? Because remember, Isaiah is writing to the people of Israel, Judah in Babylon. And Babylon, the Babylonian astral cult, as it's sometimes gone, is an astrological religion fundamentally. The sun, moon, and the stars were worshipped by the Babylonians. So this very much becomes a who's in control here, right? Are our lives governed by the sun, moon, and stars? No, absolutely not. Our lives are governed, Isaiah says, by the one who created the sun, moon, and stars and puts them in place. So is God powerful enough? Yes, absolutely. Is God unique enough? Yes, absolutely. He's different from the idols. He's different from the stars and the moon. Does he have the authority? Is he the one who's in control? Yes, absolutely. The order of the universe is established by him, not by the Babylonian gods.
And is that not also some people's view of the creation story too, that the writer of it is saying, look, you nations, you worship the sun. Our God made the sun. You worship the moon. Our God made the moon. You nations, you worship animals and count them as sacred. Our God made the animals, and so on and so forth. Is there not a parallel with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there is. And the universe and everything that inhabits it is precious because it's God's handiwork. It needs to be looked after. It needs to be cared for. God asks humanity to tend it and to keep it and to look after it. Because it all has his fingerprints all over it. He created it, but none of it is in itself holy. Only the one who created it is.
Yeah. Okay, so Isaiah is doing a good job here of showing, God is powerful enough. He does have enough authority. He is unique. And he carries on, verse 27. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel? My way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Now there's one for a poster, that one.
You've got a choice of kind of images to use with that, haven't you? Isn't that an amazing passage of scripture? I don't think I've ever read that and not been blessed by it, not been encouraged by it. Probably because kind of so very frequently I feel faint or weary and powerless. And probably because kind of our understanding is very, very searchable and very, very limited, isn't it? And I love the way Isaiah presents a God who is not only powerful enough to intervene, but actually wants to intervene as well, because that's the other part of this, isn't it? It's all right, God being able to do something about this situation, but is he motivated to? Does he care enough to? And most of us have at some stage found ourselves sitting at the bottom end of the garden, pulling at worms, grumbling to God, saying, God, you don't know how bad this is for me. You don't appreciate how awful my life is. You have forgotten me. You aren't doing anything about me. My way is hidden from the Lord. My right is disregarded by my God. And yet Isaiah says, well, excuse me, have you forgotten that he doesn't faint? He strengthens the weak. If you wait for him, and it doesn't mean kind of waiting for him like waiting for a bus. It doesn't mean like hanging around doing nothing. Waiting in this context means expectantly attending, being prepared for. Just as I've never been in Buckingham Palace yet, anyway, at time of recording, but I always imagine that the footmen are kind of stood outside the Queen's office, kind of attentive and expecting and waiting that any moment the door could swing open and there's Her Majesty, and they've got to spring into action. They're not just kind of sat around having a look at the decor kind of thing. They're waiting on her hand and foot, literally. Yeah. And that's what Isaiah means here. Those who wait for the Lord, those who attend for his action, those who are prepared to respond when they hear his call, not those who sit around putting their feet up. Our strength will be renewed because God absolutely is concerned enough. He's able to do something despite his strength being so magnificent. He needs our strength as well. He needs to empower us so that his plan and purpose can be fulfilled in our lives. So does God care? Yes, absolutely, God cares. And a demonstration of his care comes in that he puts his power into operation in our lives and does redeem us and does rescue us. Yes, absolutely judges us, but yes, is our wise and gracious King that leads us forward into the fullness of his plan and purpose.
Yeah, beautiful. I particularly think that, passages like this, in this day and age, this COVID season as well, where people are asking lots of questions. People in the church who've been in the church for many, many years, and I mean church with a capital C, who are now a little more isolated than they ever were, have more time to think about things, have less time to be structured by church practices and meeting together, are asking bigger questions. And here is God saying, in all of this season, I care, I am close, I am with you, I want the best for you. And from what we said earlier, let's reason this together. I can cope with your questions. I can cope with your anxieties and your prayers. It's lovely, isn't it?
It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Fantastic.
That such majesty and such power can be coupled with such passionate concern and such interest in the nuance and the details of our lives. You'd almost think it's preparing the way for the New Testament message of God in a manger, Emmanuel, God with us, in the smallest possible human form, which perhaps it is.
Yes, yeah, beautiful. Andrew, thank you once again. We've made it through episode 3, which was Isaiah's view of God. And I am pleased to say that the next session is the gospel according to Isaiah. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you in a week. God bless you, Andrew. Thank you.
Bless you.